What family secret was finally spilled in your family? My mother is kid 7 of 10. My aunt kid 4 who was born in 1945 did her DNA and found out that she has a different father from everyone else. She was devastated. There was always rumor that there was an affair but nobody talked about it. She has so many questions, but nobody's alive to answer her. That my parents had to get married. They always told us they got married in 1961. But it was 1962. 3 months before my sister was born. What's amusing is that my father was an accountant who was insanely fast with math. Whenever he was asked how many years they'd been married, he'd be off by 1. My mother would correct him through clenched teeth, and then my father would nod and agree. I was always told by an older relative of mine that the first child in a marriage for some reason always took less than 9 months. I always found it amusing to think about that. I see a lot of stories about people finding out that who they thought was their parents weren't the people raising them, and this one is a little bit different. My dad always thought his father who raised him wasn't his biodad, and the father thought the same. He was treated terribly by his father because the father was told he couldn't have children and my father was born prematurely, but at a healthy weight. So, everyone assumed my grandmother had an affair and got pregnant with my dad. It was to the point that after my grandmother died, my grandfather failed to even mention to his new wife that he had a son and grandchild me. Years later, my dad gets an ancestry DNA test for him and me. He find out that his dad was actually his biodad. It was shocking and sad. When she was growing up, my grandmother was told by her older siblings that she had a different father than them. They believed their mother was having an affair with a neighbor and that was my grandmother's bio father. My mom and I both took DNA tests and it matched us both with cousins from my grandmother's older siblings and with relatives from their bio dad's family. Great grandma may have indeed been having an affair, but that didn't mean my grandmother was a product of that affair. Sadly, even after explaining all of this to her, my grandmother still refuses to believe that her parents were the same as her older siblings. My grandparents are first cousins. An uncle on the same side of the family is in prison for the assassination of a presidential candidate. Family still says he was framed and is innocent. I can't believe no one has asked you for the story behind the assassination attempt. How was he caught? Mexican presidential candidate in the 90s. It's actually believed by a lot of people that he was framed. Found out my grandma had a baby as a teenager and was forced to give him up for adoption by my great-grandparents. 40 years later he found us. Same thing happened to my mom. I'm 33 now. Older half-brother is roughly 35. I hold hope that I'll meet him one day. There is hope. I'm 37 and just found my long-lost sister a few months ago. In the 1970s a dead girl was found on my grandpa's property. Everyone including the local police just assumed she was in with a bad crowd and murdered by drug dealers. In the 90s, some of his grandkids came forward about all the molestation. After that, people started to realize grandpa probably killed that girl. My cousin is actually my sister. Apparently my mom got pregnant really young and her much older sister adopted my sister and raised her as her own. It was actually an amazing moment when we found out. My cousin's sister and the sister I was raised with and I are really close. Just happened last year. We're all old now. I'm 50 and my cousin's sister is 58. So it's just a really neat thing that makes us all happy. That is awesome. I guess I just don't get why the secret was kept once you guys got old enough to understand the circumstances of why it happened that way. Genuinely curious. I think everyone who knew was fine to just leave it alone, but when my aunt died my cousin's sister found adoption papers that didn't list the birth mother. She started having an identity crisis and my mom, her real mom, couldn't bear to see it. After my mom died, I found out the real story behind my parents' marriage. She came to my father's country to visit some of her relatives, met my father, and after just 1 week she asked him to marry her so she could stay in the country. My father accepted because he had no one else, and his parents were pressing him to get married already. But the highlight of the story is that over some time, the two of them fell in love with each other. Their love only grew over the time and they were really happy together. My mother spent her last days very ill, and she would accept only my father by her bedside. He swears to this day that she was an angel sent from God to take care of him. I'm shocked that they got married just like that, out of the blue, and ended up loving each other so deeply. I can only hope to have as good and loving marriage as they had. Edit: I had no idea my parents' little secret would touch so many people. Thank you all. It means a lot. You made it worth scrolling through all these depressing stories. Thanks for sharing. My uncles are infamous criminals who killed multiple people. I thought they bred dogs. Edit: thanks for the awards. The only good thing that ever came from this. They may have also bred dogs to kill people. My de facto uncle, he and my aunt never married, but have been together since well before I was born. With a few hiccups has a child with another woman. It became common knowledge when the girl was 6 and was starting to understand the situation. At first it was a bit scandalous, but she's been welcomed with open arms by my entire family, including her half-siblings' maternal grandparents. She's treated the same as all the other kids her age. Her half-sister, my cousin, has a daughter the same age and they're best friends. Go to the same high school. Totally inseparable. Technically aunt and niece, haha. She comes to all our family events and she's an awesome kid. We're all stoked to have her in our family. We found out after my grandfather died that none of his 7 children with my grandmother were his, and that they all likely had different fathers. Do you think it was cheating, or an old-to-me version of sperm donation? Possibly due to infertility. This is actually interesting, and was definitely more common than people think. It is actually still something that happens to this day, when people cannot afford traditional infertility treatment or just don't want to go through it. I read an article recently about men who even donate their sperm for free outside of the system. They're happy to do it and don't mind helping people out. Of course it introduces some complications because it's unregulated. Typically, there are limits on donors, so that there aren't too many related people in one gene pool. I personally know a lesbian couple who have 2 kids from private donation and a turkey baster. When my paternal grandfather died, the federal government reached out to do a state funeral. He'd been career army and a colonel, so we didn't question it. Then the funeral came, and they went all out. Huge procession. People showing up who are really big names, like heads of debts, senators, retired senators, people from the CIA and state debt. It was nuts, and we were all super confused. Turns out he was a key dude in the OC during WWII, and when the OC splintered into the CIA and Secret Service, he went the Secret Service route. He wasn't on White House detail, but instead worked in a covert office that dealt with counterfeiting and currency. He went blind when I was a toddler and retired from the army. For whatever reason, he told no one about all his covert work with the OC and Secret Service, and the only person who knew my grandmother was sworn to secrecy and never told anyone. My father grew up thinking he was just a colonel working on base. Only after his death were we given all sorts of cool shit like publications by him, lectures given by him, and all kinds of things from various things he did and was known for. All I knew him as was a blind old man who was perpetually smoking, drinking and being a crotchety bastard. Turns out he was a bad methodica and all, but none of us knew. About a month ago, my mother-in-law's 88-year-old sister revealed on her deathbed that her husband's best friend was actually the father of all 4 of her children. Her husband was an abusive grade A jerk by all accounts. While everyone was shocked, no one was saddened by this news. Did the friend know? Yes, he contacted with all 4 children. Youngest is in his 50s within hours of her passing. Also, one of the son's first comments was, "Is that why he gave me his old car when I needed one back in college?" Why didn't she just leave her husband for the friend? Was it fear? My great-grandfather didn't die of cancer. He died from complications after being shot when one of his businesses was being robbed. Maybe. He also spent a lot of time in Atlantic City. He also had a lot of partners in the Teamsters and other unions in coal country. Also, everyone called him Smiling Tony, but his name wasn't Tony. He died in the 60s, long before my time. But when my great-grandmother died 20 years ago, a very old guy showed up to the funeral in a white suit and all of the oldest people in my family kisses his hand. When I asked, no one knew who he was. My grandfather moved his family away from central PA in the late 60s and disconnected from all of this, but there it is. I always wonder how long it will be before my neighbor's kids figure out their daddy is a dealer little crooked. There was at one Christmas he got shot in the leg stealing from a farm and hobbled around for weeks. He's trying to go straight right now. I heard an absolute blowout fight like 2 months ago. As soon as the bigger kids left with the grandparents, the missus was smoking ice in the house and he screamed at her about not doing that in the house. Not wanting the kids to see. My neighbor's similar. He's trying to turn his life around. And man, I want his life to work out. My uncle served in Vietnam. While over there his troop found a baby that had been orphaned or abandoned. They aren't sure. My uncle was shipping back to Australia soon and wanted to adopt him. But my aunt said no, they'd only been married about 4 months when he was drafted. So while I don't agree with my aunt's actions and generally don't like her as a person, I can understand why she said no. My uncle's troop found a family to raise the baby. And that's the story the whole family knows. The secret is that my uncle and some other guys from his troop stayed in contact with the family and the kid, sending them money every month to help raise him and then to help him go to university, and eventually helped him and his adoptive family move to Australia in the last 90s. My aunt and the rest of my family had no idea all this time. It only came out when my aunt and uncle divorced in 2017. And she had a forensic accountant go through their bank records. She worked at a bank for like 40 years and always noticed the money missing. But his reasons were always justified. Since we all know now, my uncle has introduced some of us to the guy and his family. They're all really lovely people. Edit to clarify as to why my aunt is a bad person in this instance. I was half asleep when I posted this and realized I left out a pretty important detail to explain why I don't like my aunt for this facepum. To preface, I'm child free, and if my husband was in this situation, I'd say no as well. It's not the fact she said no to adopting the kid that makes me dislike her for this. It's her reason. Aunt is very racist against Asian people. Doesn't matter what part of Asia. She hates them. She's the kind of person who will yell "go back to your own country" at random strangers who even vaguely look like they may have Asian ancestry. She also cut contact with my cousin, her daughter, because my cousin's husband is half Japanese. She said, in front of my family with no shame, that if the kid hadn't been Asian, she would have said yes to adopting him. I was waiting for I was that baby. My mom and older brother are not biologically related to me. My bio mom died sometime after I was born, leaving me, my sister, and my dad behind. My brother was the one that told me. My parents never told me because they wanted to protect me from the truth. But my brother thought that was a BS reason for me to not know. I don't know if my parents know that I know the truth, but I don't want to bring it up either. Edit to address some questions. My mom immigrated here along with my older brother when he was a kid. My dad also immigrated here, and my sister and I were born after he came. I don't know much about our family history beyond that. My brother revealed this info around when I was 18. He isn't the type to lie about something like this. He also said my sister is apparently aware of the truth because she has a memory of my bio mom being in physical contact with her. I don't think too differently about my family because of this. My mom is still my mom. I met my wife when my daughter was 16 months old. Bio dad was never in the picture. Once it was looking like a relationship that would last. We got married and briefly toyed with the idea of just never telling her she was around 3-4 at this time. Ultimately, we decided that it would be better to not hide it, though that has created some issues with her now half siblings and some self-esteem issues. I just felt that her potentially finding this out as an adult might be pretty traumatizing and fucked up. It's a pretty big lie of a mission, and I just wasn't comfortable with it. Also as important, I believe, for medical history related things she'll encounter later in life. Lastly, it gives Bio dad the chance to do an about face, perhaps as unlikely as that may be, and get to know his daughter without the massive trauma of an unspoken lie being brought into play. To ease into it, at around 4 years old, I started saying things to her like, "After I met you and mommy and this insert situation happened, before I met you and mommy." She was able to put 2 and 2 together as time progressed, so it wouldn't have to be a sit-down confession, but rather a more evolutionary realization which we guided her through.